Okay, thank you. Okay, we're online. I'm coming here today as kind of a CSS evangelist. I'm not really an evangelist, but more about because I have put it in my head to write a book this year that will teach CSS to JavaScripters, because I think it's necessary. So before I start, show of hands, who here is primarily a JavaScripter? Not all, interesting. Of those JavaScripters, how many of you needs at least a little bit of CSS in your daily work? Almost everybody, yeah. How many of you are comfortable with CSS? Okay, I had hoped for a little less comfortable audience because I need to figure out how to teach CSS to JavaScripters. That's basically my mission today. I have prepared a fairly brief presentation that I'm going to give now, and afterwards I would hope to have some sort of discussion about why it is that there is a subset of JavaScripters that doesn't like CSS, or at least pretends it doesn't like CSS. So, but before we start, let's go briefly over a few details. It turns out to be difficult to teach CSS to JavaScripters, not because it's difficult or because JavaScripters are stupid, but because there is a disconnect somewhere. When I start to enthusiastically explain something about CSS, yeah, you know, you do this and you do that, some JavaScripters just kind of their head closes and they don't want to listen anymore. And I don't think that's because they find it too difficult. It's something else, but I haven't really put my finger on what that something else exactly is. So I'm kind of hoping that tonight will help in that regard. I intend to find this out, and that's why I'm giving this presentation here. So, over the past few weeks, I've been thinking about teaching CSS to JavaScripters. Basically, I have a few theories in mind now, which I'm going to present to you. And I'm very much looking for feedback. So if you have something to say, don't say it right away, but I will stop talking after a while, and then you can talk to me, and I will actually take notes and take you very seriously. So with all the slides that are following, please keep in mind, does what I am saying make sense, and does it help you or does it confuse you? Because I think it would help me, but I'm not certain anymore. It might actually confuse you, and you are actually the target audience of what I'm intending to say. Before we start, remember this. This is true for JavaScript, it's also true for CSS. Browsers are the most hostile development platforms in the world because you never know what's going to happen next. Right? And that is something that both on the CSS and on the JavaScript side is sometimes forgotten. So just so that we're all on the same page, we're having a difficult job. Now, is CSS a programming language? Question mark. Who here thinks CSS is a programming language? Who here thinks it's not a programming language? Who here is not sure? Okay. I asked on Twitter, you know, a very scientific poll. About 3,000 people replied, which is good, and the no's just barely have it. CSS is not a programming language, according to my followers on Twitter, 3,000 of them. Well, I'm not sure what this says, but it does say that this is a fairly controversial question. I mean, I got some feedback about that as well. Oh, you're asking a very controversial question. Yeah, why is it controversial? I mean, you can say it's a programming language, you can say it's not a programming language, you know, you can have a debate about that. It probably partly depends on how you define a programming language, but why would any of that be controversial? I've never really understood that, so I'm ignoring the controversial part. I'm just noting that there is a difference of opinion. CSS is declarative while JavaScript is imperative. This, to me, is right now I am seeing it as maybe a stumbling block for some JavaScripters to learn CSS. Maybe some JavaScripters have trouble wrapping their heads around a declarative language. I'm not sure. I'm just making this up on the spot, but it could be true. As an example, in CSS you just say make all links red. Well, in JavaScript, you have to be more elaborate in your instructions. This has advantages and disadvantages. The question I'm asking, is this difference enough to make learning CSS more difficult? Is there a mental hoop you have to jump through in order to understand that this is the same as this, but just differently formulated? I don't know. I don't really care at the moment if CSS is a programming language. But what I've decided to do is to pretend that it is in fact a programming language and figure out if that helps people learn CSS better. Or maybe it makes stuff more difficult. So far, the feedback I've received seems to indicate that it does make learning CSS a little bit easier for some. But if you have a different opinion, please do tell me, because I need to know. Because I want that book that I'm going to write to be actually useful to you, and not just a statement of, you know, orthodox thought on CSS and, oh, shame on you that you do not understand that. That's a bit of a problem within the CSS community. Sometimes people go, oh, you silly JavaScripters, you do not know what you're talking about, blah, blah, blah. It's all nonsense, ignore it. But do think about what are the differences, and are they so huge as is sometimes being thought. So, let's take this extremely simple bit of CSS. This is a JavaScript variant on that, right? So first CSS, really easy. If you have a link in a menu and the mouse is over it, make it have a blue color. In JavaScript, you would have to be a bit more complicated about it. This is very bad code, by the way. You should never write any mouse over like this, but I'm keeping it simple for now. The CSS is much simpler than the JavaScript, until you try to do something more complicated, like this. If you want to have an additional variable that tells you if the mouse over effect should actually take place. This is pretty hard to do in CSS. So what we're seeing here is that CSS gives you more elegance and speed. Speed both in developing and in the browser. Because writing that simple half a statement we saw just now takes about half a minute, while the browser is very, very much optimized for this sort of operations. On the other hand, JavaScript gives you more control. If you want to do something that's not a simple, oh, if the mouse is over this link, make it blue, but if there is a more complicated factor involved with control structures and that sort of thing, then JavaScript is possibly the better solution. So which one is better? Oh, that is a pity. Yeah, it depends. And you're getting free advice here. I mean, but you know, if you tell this to anybody, oh, it depends, you have to be very grave and solemn, and you know, as if you have spent many, many decades thinking of this, and went to a retreat, and you know, had a meaningful conversation with a lot of people. Yes, it depends. Of course, it depends. It's simple, but sometimes people have to pay a lot of money in order to take simple advice. That's basically the basics of consultancy, right? Let's talk about control statements for a little bit. This, again, a slight variation on the CSS code we saw earlier. All links in the menu have a blue color. Is this maybe an if statement? Is it maybe something like this? The CSS version of this little bit of JavaScript. Or is this maybe a for loop? A variation on this bit of JavaScript. I mean, there is something to say for both. And again, we're talking only the simplest ifs and the simplest fors here. As soon as you want to do something more than just iterate over a bunch of equal or nearly equal elements, or have a very simple if statement, if this is the case, then CSS is starting to get into trouble, while JavaScript can still easily handle it. But what we have seen now is that it is possible to say that CSS selectors are both if statements and for loops. And the big question is, does that help you in any way learn CSS better? Or does it just confuse you? Do you think, oh my God, this programming language that is not really a programming language is so weird that ifs and fors are the same? I mean, I need to figure out what's going on in your head here. So does it matter? Does it help you understand CSS better, knowing that you could see a simple CSS selector as both an if statement and a for loop? That is basically the main question I'm having so far. I mean, my research is still ongoing. I'm not totally sure where I will end up. So far what I heard is people saying, yeah, kind of makes sense what you're saying. So if you're saying the same, well, that's great on the one hand because I haven't wasted my time, but not so good on the other hand because, to be honest, I have no clue what I'm saying. I'm just making it up as I go along, and I'm just hoping that it will spark some sort of interest, some sort of lessening of mental confusion in somebody's mind. So to wrap up this very short presentation, this is something else I would like to ask, and especially after people who know a little bit more about CSS. In that book, I will eventually have to treat some CSS topics, right? I can't just be very vague and theoretical about it. I have to teach people some actual CSS. So what I thought so far of teaching in the book is the list that's going to follow, because I think these are the core concepts of CSS. And there's a lot more to CSS than what I'm going to show you just now. But I think that the stuff that I'm not showing you is relatively less important than the stuff I'm going to show you. First of all, selectors and how to keep them simple, especially the second part. The selector is simple. Oh, all paragraphs. Oh, all paragraphs in a div with a certain class name. That's easy. But keeping them simple is not. Especially when you start to have problems with the cascade in CSS. Cascade is it's a different topic. I'll get back to that. Secondly, you need to know something about layout, grid, and flexbox. If I had written this book even 3 or 4 years ago, it would have been floats. But fortunately, we do not need floats anymore. Who here has ever used floats, and mean in a big way? Who here is happy that you've ever used floats in a big way? 2, okay. You have a different viewpoint than the rest of us. Nowadays, layout is about grid and flexbox. I need to teach the box model. You know, margin, padding, border. It's it's really simple once you understand it. But if you don't understand it, it can be really complicated. Besides, exactly what does padding left 20% mean, or margin left 20%? There can be some confusion about that. So I absolutely have to teach this. Cascading and variable scope. Here we delve into another serious subtopic of CSS in JS. I have hardly talked about it yet. I'm not really going to talk about it today, except to briefly note that I think that the whole discussion around CSS in JavaScript is in order to avoid the global scope of CSS variables, or CSS selectors. You do not want all paragraphs in the document to have a certain style, but only the paragraphs within the specific model that you're building right now. CSS has been very bad about giving you access to local variables. And that is true. And I think it's a valid complaint of JavaScripters about CSS. But I will still have to explain to you how it actually works right now, because this is the thing you will have to use. I have to talk briefly about inheritance. You know, the way in which lower-lying elements, child elements of certain elements, inherit part of the styles of their parent, but not everything. I have to talk about media queries briefly, because they're the foundation under responsive design. And I have to talk about units. And as far as I can see, oh yeah, and this is a question mark. Do I talk about positioning and viewports? I would like to, because I happen to know a lot about viewports. I can easily talk an hour about mobile viewports. And if you think, what the hell is a viewport? Come to a future session of mine. I will explain in excruciating detail what a viewport is and why it's so bloody complicated. But is this important enough to put in this list of CSS topics? I'm not sure yet, but I could easily write it. So, My first question was the whole thing about the if statements and the for loops, and CSS maybe being a programming language, but in a declarative way, not an imperative way. That whole thing, does it make sense to you, and does it help you understand CSS better? My second question is there anything else that should be treated in this list? With that, we have come to the end of the presentation that I prepared. Let me see how much time we have left. We have quite a bit of time left. I like that. And I think we could start talking, have some discussion. I will put the slides online. I always do that, probably later when I have the time. So don't be afraid that you missed anything. Does anybody have something very important to say, have a great idea about what I'm talking about? I'm talking nonsense, or that I'm being brilliant. I prefer the brilliance part, but you know, sometimes I talk nonsense. Yes?
So, first of all, to my mind, programming analogy...
Oh, we're going to give you a microphone. Excellent. Good idea. I have to make notes as well.
Cool. So the problem I find with the programming analogy is obviously, as you said, the kind of it can be a for loop, or you're trying to envision it as an if loop, and that's very confusing to me.
Okay.
To me, I find it more. It's easier to think of it as I don't know the name of it off the top of my head, but have you ever seen those images where it's built up of layers? So you have a pane of black, you have a pane of yellow, you have a pane of red, and it's layered, and the whole image is created through like glass with paint layers on it. You slowly build up an image. And envisioning CSS is more like that, is kind of more how it works, because then you've got the layering, you've got the, I declared all paragraphs as red, but then this paragraph is not red because of the cascading style sheet that I applied on top of it, but most of them aren't.
Okay. To you, is this about selectors in general, or more specifically about the cascade? Because for the cascade, I find it a very interesting analogy. But for the selectors as a whole, I'm not sure.
Okay, so it kind of goes more into cascade, but then for me, when I'm thinking of selectors, it's more of a go through all objects on the page and then see if anything ticks this rule and then apply it. It'd be like a giant for loop across the whole DOM element.
It is, you do not see that as an entire for loop? Or you
as
do?
One giant for loop, but like with all rules included, not like for each rule go through and check the entire DOM, because that almost sounds like you're doing a lot of work when you're not really.
Okay.
And then the only other thing
it is a lot of work. Yeah, that is true.
The only other
but I really like this thing about layered images as an analogy for the cascades. I simply did not think about that yet.
The only other one that I wanted to say is at the end you mentioned selectors and stuff, and I wondered where you were going to put in selector priority. So how you increase the importance of so that's a common pitfall that a lot of people come into. Why is this div not being thing? It's got a class name. But actually div child parent is more specific. I forget the term that they use. Specificity. Yeah.
Say it 3 times very fast. You'll never forget it again.
So I don't know if that was included already in your selector topic, but
sort
that's
of. Yes, the cascade mostly. But yes, I will definitely have to talk about that because it's and that's why I said that especially creating simple selectors is so important, because the fact that we have these complicated specificity rules means that if you create a really, really complex selector, you can expect side effects that you don't really want to. But yes, I am definitely going to go into specificity.
Peter, 2 quick questions from YouTube.
Yeah.
First one is CSS Turing complete?
I don't know.
Okay. And the second one, is there a JavaScript library that generates CSS from JavaScript?
Again?
Is there any library which generates CSS from JavaScript?
Is that a question?
Yeah. Is there?
It happens, yes.
Okay, thanks.
I think it's a follow-up to the previous question. So I think how the browsers are treating CSS is they go from the back, right, from the right, and
In selectors, yes.
In selectors, yeah, exactly. It goes from the right. So in that sense, it's if you think of it as a for loop, then the object that you have in the for should have the property parent, and you can put any conditions against it or something. So it's a imperative declarative language, but still the browsers do the imperative, treat it the imperative way. See, so you just have to check how the browsers are interpreting CSS, and then you have the answer for your question.
Yes, but that is more theoretically. You are completely right, but it's more difficult than you would think because a style sheet can grow so immensely huge. I mean, I've got a not very huge style sheet, and I'm already getting confused. This is a different topic, but it's still something that I need to address in some way. I want to make a note of your comment. Does this count as imperative?
Because the browsers are imperative.
They do it in a certain order, that is true, but I've always seen an entire style sheet as something that's applied at once, and that is how it ought to work. I mean, the order of the declaration matters only for specificity and cascading, you know. If you something that's gone later overrides that something that was defined first. But other than that, it should all be applied simultaneously. So I'm not entirely sure what you mean here. Could you
elaborate?
Could you finish my sentence here? Does this count as imperative because?
Because the browser is written in the imperative language.
Okay. I'm tempted to say no right now, but if anyone has another opinion, I would love to hear about this.
Yeah, I think treating it like how these selectors work and explaining them in an imperative way is a bit contradictive, or it might confuse people. I think I would be confused as a beginning developer. But maybe if there's an imperative construct, it would be like a match clause in some languages, and that would be more true.
And explaining them as?
A match clause.
Match?
Yeah, like a match statement in, I don't know, Rust has them. And,
okay, I'll look into it.
And I'm thinking, like, as a JavaScript developer just starting, like maybe making a web application, some design patterns, like some general stuff. That's like, how do you set up, or do you use like to central layout? Do you use a flexbox, or do you use like margin auto?
Yes,
stuff like that.
I am not totally sure that my book should go that route because it is a different topic than just explaining the basics of CSS. Basically, what I hope to achieve is that somebody reads my book and says, "Oh, now I understand, you know, how CSS as a whole works, and now I need to figure out a lot of details, including design patterns." So I don't think I will treat design patterns. Maybe here and there a little bit, but not in a serious way, because I think it would make the book too huge. I mean, I do not intend to explain all of CSS, just the most important parts. Maybe kind of CSS the good parts. I'm not sure yet. Would be an interesting name.
Very popular.
Briefly write that down.
Okay, maybe my suggestion would be very constructive, but I would just want to share my wish that your book will be issued in form of comic book.
Comic book.
It's a perfect,
wonderful. Are you an artist?
I'm not, but I know artists who might be interested in this enterprise. I really believe that the Point and Guide to Ruby opened a great experiment. That it was a great initiative to write a book in form of graphic novel about such a static topic, and CSS as a language about the visual stuff.
Okay, I see what you mean. I see what you mean. We're going to make a note. I don't think it will actually happen, but I am going to make a note. I mean, I was at one point considering working with an illustrator. Not as to make it a comic book, but because sometimes illustrations are so very important, you know, just to show people, okay, the margin goes to here and then the padding takes over, that sort of stuff. So maybe. Anything else? Yeah.
So regarding topics that you may or may not decide to include, thinking personally for me was a big eye-opening thing when I started working with level 3 selectors, like the new or not so new anymore, level 3 selectors. Like things to play with attributes and value from attributes. I think that's a huge, important deal in the modern web app universe.
I think I am going to at least give a table of all the possible CSS selectors. Yes, I think I would. Because it's interesting, you could see those selectors as, I mean, I've written something on my site about this. By the way, if you do want to follow me thinking about this, I may be jumping to entirely the wrong conclusions. I'm trying to write a blog post every week, a short blog post about this topic. And I wanted to show you something in the if statements and for loops. Oh, by the way, this is clearly an if statement. At media and at support rules are clearly if statements. There's no doubt about this. This. So this is, let's call it a for loop for now, just for the sake of argument. These are exceptions. So it's as if you put an if in the for loop and say, oh, if it's the first child, do something else, and oh, if it has ID current, do something else again. So it is possible to make CSS for loops slightly more complicated than what I showed in my presentation, but it may be weird, because you would intuitively expect the stuff that modifies a for loop to be inside the for loop, and in CSS it's not. It's just under the for loop that it changes. So this, and in this way, especially the not selector is really interesting. I had some great conversations with a few people about this book. And what I also found was, suppose you use both the not and the first child on the same element, so something like a not current colon first child. I found that some JavaScripters think that you first take all the elements with ID current and then take the first child of that element, which is not actually true. You know, it's all elements that are both a first child and do not have an ID equals current. But that is the sort of thing that I really, really need to know about teaching CSS. Sometimes people just misunderstand one slight tiny bit of, especially the selectors, which may cause them to completely misunderstand CSS. So these are really interesting things for me. So attribute selectors and such, yes, I am definitely going to treat those. Anything else?
Yes, I think. On the question of CSS is programming language, I just Googled, of course, and I found it is Turing complete with the help of user input.
Interesting.
In my mind, that does not count, so I think CSS is not a programming language. Also, for me, explaining the selectors if statements or loops doesn't really help it. In my mind, it makes it a little more complicated. For me, it looks more like filters like SQL or LINQ in C#.
Selectors look more like...
yeah, but that could be different for other people. The main problem I have with CSS is that I cannot debug it. If I want to do something, last week I was centering a box. I was using a max width and a margin auto and stuff like that, and it didn't work. And I don't know how to find why it didn't work, let alone what I need to do to make it work.
Yeah.
So I just trial and error. If your book helps me do that, I'll buy
box
it.
model stuff, yes, definitely. But you are very right that this is one of the biggest differences between JavaScript and CSS. You know, it's if you make only one tiny little mistake in JavaScript, a misplaced comma, etc., the whole program crashes, and you know that's something wrong. In CSS, it just silently glosses over any problems that it finds. To be honest, I do not know how to explain that better than I did just now, just in a few more paragraphs. I mean, this is just something that is the case and that you will have to learn when you work with CSS. So if anybody has any bright ideas on that, I'd love to hear it.
And yeah, now the last person, and then if you have other questions or suggestions, you can do it after the talk.
Okay.
I would like to elaborate on your story. It's all great and beautiful and dandy when you just start with a blank CSS sheet. But what do you do with the legacy? Like when you just get some WordPress block with like 20 libraries in it. How do you approach it?
How do you approach it? Good question. With trepidation, very carefully, you know. Try to find somebody who actually knows something about the code base. You probably will not, because otherwise it wouldn't be such a huge problem. I do not have an easy answer for you, except what I occasionally do is just start turning off parts of CSS. You know, I take this block has something to do with a class equals special one, whatever that may be. Let's take it my class, something like that. I mean, I once found a bit of my own CSS where the most important selector was a class special 3. Then you know you've done something wrong. And in the case, take that bit of special 1, just remove it, see what happens. And with a bit of luck, you can just at least weed some of the dead wood out there and find yourself with a slightly reduced code base. But this is probably the most difficult part of CSS development, and I do not pretend that I can give you a simple answer to that. It's just really, really difficult. With that, I think we're out of time. Yes. Thank you so much. You've really helped me, and we will see what happens.